In the summer of 1930, a convoy of trucks crossed the American border from Canada, carrying what appeared to be industrial equipment. It was not industrial equipment. It was whiskey, cases of it, moving through one of the most efficient smuggling networks ever built on North American soil. The man who organized that network was Samuel Bronfman, a hotel keeper's son from the Manitoba prairies who had decided, sometime around 1920, that prohibition was not a moral mandate. It was a business opportunity. He was right. By the time prohibition ended in 1933, the Bronfmans had made more money than most American families would accumulate across 5 generations. They had also made connections to politicians, to crime bosses, to the financiers who moved money quietly between both worlds. That money became legitimate. Those connections became influence. This is the story of how a bootlegger's fortune bought its way into the center of American power. And what it built there, Ekaterinoslav, in what is now Ukraine, was the kind of place that made emigration feel less like a choice and more like a survival instinct. Jewish communities in the Russian Empire in the late 19th century existed within a legal system designed to restrict them. The Pale of Settlement confined Jewish residents to specific territories. Periodic pogroms turned communal violence into a recurring feature of daily life, and the economic ceiling for Jewish families was both literal and enforced. Yechiel and Minnie Bronfman left with their children in 1889. They were heading, in theory, for Argentina, which was actively recruiting Jewish settlers. They ended up, through the particular logic of immigrant journeys, in the Canadian prairies. First in Brandon, Manitoba, then in Wapella, Saskatchewan, then in Yorkton. They farmed. They failed at farming. They tried other things. Yechiel eventually settled into the hotel business, or rather the business adjacent to hotels, which in the Canadian prairies of the early 1900s meant managing establishments that served alcohol alongside accommodation. This distinction matters. The Bronfman family's relationship with liquor did not begin with Samuel. It began with his father, in the respectable and entirely legal form of hotel management, Samuel Bronfman. Born in 1889, the year his family left Russia, was the 4th of 8 children, and from early on the most commercially alert. He watched his father manage establishments, absorbed patterns of trade and money, and stored lessons he would later scale beyond anything Yechiel Bronfman could have imagined. Sam dropped out of school young. He worked various trades, had a brief stint in a logging camp, and returned to the family's hospitality business with a sharper sense of what it was actually selling. Alcohol was not an amenity, it was the product. The rooms were the amenity. By the mid-1910s, Sam and his brothers, Harry, Abe, and Alan, were operating hotels across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They were not wealthy. They were functional, keeping the family fed, maintaining a small foothold in an economy where Jewish entrepreneurs faced significant discrimination in finance and professional trades. Then, the Canadian provinces began going dry. Between 1915 and 1917, most Canadian provinces enacted their own prohibition laws, preceding the American federal prohibition by several years. For most businesses, this was a crisis. For Sam Bronfman, it was a clarifying moment. He recognized almost immediately that prohibition does not eliminate demand. It relocates it, and whoever controls the relocation controls the market. He began quietly. He registered as a mail-order liquor dealer, exploiting a legal loophole that allowed alcohol to be ordered from wet provinces and shipped to dry ones. The operation was technically lawful, enormously profitable, and the foundation of everything that would follow. Sam Bronfman was 30 years old. He had found his industry. January 17, 1920, was the day the United States went dry. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, backed by years of temperance movement, organizing, and wartime morale arguments, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors across the entire country. It did not ban consumption. It did not address demand. It simply removed the legal supply chain and left the demand in place, enormous, immediate, and ready to be filled by whoever was clever enough to fill it. Sam Bronfman was in Canada, which meant he was sitting on the legal side of a very long and very porous border, with access to liquor licenses, distillery connections, and a growing understanding of how to move product efficiently. He did not need to become a criminal in the American sense. He needed to supply criminals in the American sense with the product they needed to meet American demand. The structure he built was elegant in its simplicity. The Bronfmans established a series of warehouses. They were eventually called boozoriums in the press, near the American border in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where liquor was stored and sold wholesale to buyers who transported it south. The buyers were often American bootleggers, some of them connected to organized crime networks. The Bronfmans' legal position was that of suppliers on the Canadian side of the transaction. What happened after the liquor crossed the border was, technically, not their concern. This is the argument the family has always made, and it contains a kernel of legal truth alongside a substantial practical fiction. The Bronfmans knew where the liquor was going. They sold in quantities that made only large-scale distribution sensible. They maintained relationships with buyers who were, unambiguously, part of American organized crime. They were suppliers to bootleggers, a different legal category, but not a different moral one. Sam's operational genius was logistics. He understood that the bottleneck in illegal liquor distribution was not the liquor itself. There was plenty of it in Canada, but the reliable movement of it across a border that stretched thousands of miles and was patrolled with inconsistent intensity. He developed networks of routes, relationships with border officials where useful, and distribution contacts who could absorb large quantities and move them deeper into American cities. The money that flowed back was remarkable. By the mid-1920s, the Bronfman operation had grown beyond its prairie origins. Sam had moved to Montreal, which offered better banking infrastructure, better connections to international markets, and better access to the American Northeast. He purchased a distillery. The Distillers Corporation acquired in 1924, and for the first time began producing rather than simply distributing. This was a strategic shift of enormous significance. By owning production, the Bronfmans were no longer dependent on purchasing from other suppliers at market rates. They controlled the entire chain from grain to bottle. Their margins expanded, their leverage over buyers expanded, their ability to guarantee quality and therefore command loyalty from major buyers expanded. In 1928, Sam engineered the merger that would define the family's financial future. He combined Distillers Corporation with Joseph E. Seagram and Sons, an established Canadian distillery with significant assets and, crucially, a legitimate business history predating Prohibition. The combined entity, Distillers Corporation Seagrams Limited, gave the Bronfmans a large, credible corporate structure inside which their considerably less credible revenues could be absorbed and managed. The timing was, as Sam always operated, precise. Prohibition was showing its first serious signs of political strain by the late 1920s. Sam understood it would eventually end, and that when it ended, the bootlegger, who had built legitimate infrastructure, would convert more smoothly than the one who had not. His American distribution partners, the Capones, the Lucianos, the organized crime networks that had been his buyers for a decade, were not building legitimate infrastructure. They were building criminal empires with inherently limited longevity. Sam was building a business. The relationship with American organized crime during this period is the part of the Bronfman story the family has spent the most energy managing and the least energy acknowledging. The documented connections are real. Arnold Rothstein, the New York gambling and bootlegging figure whose murder in 1928 became one of the era's great unsolved crimes, was a Bronfman customer and, by some accounts, a financial partner in specific distribution arrangements. Lucky Luciano's network purchased Bronfman product regularly. Meyer Lansky, the financial architect of American organized crime, maintained connections to the Bronfman supply chain across multiple years. These connections were not shameful anomalies from Sam's perspective. They were business. The American organized crime figures were the most reliable large-scale buyers in the market. Sam sold to them because they could absorb volume and pay consistently. He did not, as far as the documentary record shows, participate in their other enterprises, the gambling, the violence, the protection rackets. He sold whiskey to criminals and remained, in legal terms, in Canada. When Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933, with ratification of the 21st Amendment, Sam Bronfman was ready. He had a distillery. He had a brand. He had capital. He had distribution networks across North America that could be converted, almost overnight, from smuggling routes to legal wholesale channels. He had spent 13 years building what appeared, from a certain angle, to be a legitimate business with an unfortunate side operation. From another angle, it was an illegal empire with a legitimate shell, waiting for the law to change. The law changed. The shell became the company, and the company, within a decade, would become the largest distillery operation in the world. The years between 1933 and 1950 are the years the Bronfman family prefers to remember. The bootleggers' decade was buried under the legitimacy of what came after, and what came after was genuinely extraordinary. Seagrams, the brand name Sam had acquired through the merger and then promoted with ferocious energy, became, in the post-Prohibition American market, a dominant force with startling speed. Sam understood something that many of his competitors did not. The end of Prohibition had not simply reopened the legal liquor market. It had created a consumer class with money to spend on alcohol, but without the established brand loyalties that a mature legal market would have developed over decades. The American drinker in 1934 was, in a real sense, starting fresh. Sam moved to define that fresh start. He invested heavily in aged whiskies at a moment when many competitors were pushing young, cheap product. He understood that scarcity, real or manufactured, creates desire, and that desire, in the premium goods market, is a more reliable driver of revenue than volume pricing. Seagram's VO, the flagship blended Canadian whiskey, was positioned explicitly as a premium product. It was priced accordingly. It sold. The company expanded aggressively into the American market, purchasing distilleries, signing distribution agreements, and building a sales infrastructure that mirrored, in its legal form, the distribution network Sam had operated during Prohibition. Many of the people who ran the legal distribution had, in fact, run the illegal distribution. The institutional knowledge transferred seamlessly. By 1948, Seagram's had revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The company owned distilleries in Canada, the United States, and Scotland. It produced not just Canadian whiskey, but Scotch, bourbon, gin, and vodka. Its portfolio spanned multiple price points. Its American market share was without serious equal, Sam moved his family to a mansion in Westmount, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Montreal. He maintained an apartment in New York, where he spent significant time managing American operations. He began, with deliberate effort, building the philanthropic and social profile that in mid-century North America marked a family's arrival into the tier of genuine respectability. Jewish philanthropy was central to this project. Sam was deeply committed to Jewish communal life, genuinely as a matter of personal identity, and strategically as a means of building networks and demonstrating standing. He became a significant donor to Jewish institutions in Montreal and beyond. He became involved with the Canadian Jewish Congress and later with international Jewish advocacy organizations. This is where the Bronfman story takes its first turn toward explicit political territory. The immediate post-war period confronted the Jewish world with the Holocaust's full scope. Sam Bronfman was among the community leaders who understood and was profoundly haunted by the question of whether more could have been done during the war to rescue European Jews, the question of political access, of connections to heads of state and foreign ministers, of whether money and relationships could move governments toward action, became for Sam not merely a business consideration, but a moral one. He could not undo the murder of 6 million people. He could build infrastructure to ensure that Jewish communities had political voice going forward. He would not allow future catastrophes to find the community without allies in the corridors where decisions were made. The combination of wealth, ambition, and this specific moral urgency produced a particular approach to political engagement, one that understood power not as something granted to citizens by good governments, but as something acquired by those with sufficient resources and sufficient will. Sam's philanthropic giving in the post-war period was extensive and carefully targeted. He gave to hospitals, to universities, to cultural institutions in Montreal and in Israel. He built the Bronfman name into the Canadian Jewish philanthropic landscape with the same systematic energy he had applied to building Seagram's distribution. Each donation created a relationship. Each relationship created access. His relationship with Canadian political leaders was developed with equal care. The Liberal Party of Canada, the governing party through most of the mid-20th century, found in Sam Bronfman both a significant donor and a useful connection to the business community. Sam found in liberal politicians access to government in ways that served his commercial interests. This was not corruption in any straightforward sense. It was the normalized operation of political finance in a system that makes large donors, comfortable and ordinary citizens, irrelevant. Sam was simply very good at the system as it existed. The deeper question, the one that runs underneath the entire Bronfman story, is what happens when a family builds its initial fortune through a decade of systematic law-breaking and then purchases respectability through philanthropy and political donation. Does the money launder? Does enough time and enough giving convert the source into something that no longer registers? Sam Bronfman seemed to believe so, or at least to act on that belief. He wanted, above almost everything else, to be acknowledged as a pillar of the Canadian establishment. The specific honor he coveted was a Senate appointment. Recognition from the government that Sam Bronfman belonged among the country's distinguished citizens. He never received it. Despite his wealth, his connections, and his decades of giving, the Senate appointment was denied. Sam believed, and said openly to people close to him, that anti-Semitism was a factor in the denial. He may have been right. He may also have been a man whose past was slightly too visible for the establishment he was trying to enter. His children would try again, in different ways, in different arenas, Edgar Bronfman Sr., Sam's son, born in 1929, grew up inside wealth, but without the urgent hunger that had driven his father. Where Sam was a builder by necessity, Edgar was an heir with options. He attended Williams College and McGill, moved through the social world of wealthy North American Jewry with ease, and in 1957 moved to New York to manage Seagram's American operations. Edgar was not his father. He was smoother, better educated, more comfortable in formal social settings. He was also politically ambitious in ways that Sam had been but never quite achieved, because Edgar's ambitions were legible to the American establishment in ways that Sam's Eastern European immigrant identity never quite was. New York in the 1950s and 1960s was the center of American political finance. Edgar Bronfman inserted himself into it methodically. He gave to Democratic candidates. He built relationships with the Kennedy Circle. He developed access that, over decades, would grow into something resembling genuine political influence, not the influence of an elected official, but the influence of a man whose calls were returned by people who mattered. Seagram's itself continued expanding. Under Edgar's management, the company extended beyond distilled spirits into entertainment investments, oil exploration, and other diversified holdings. It remained fabulously profitable. It continued generating the resource that made all other Bronfman activities possible: money, in enormous and continuous quantities. Edgar Bronfman Sr. became president of the World Jewish Congress in 1981, and in that role he demonstrated something the Bronfman family had understood since Sam's bootlegging days. Money, applied with sufficient intelligence and patience, can move institutions that appear immovable. The World Jewish Congress was, in 1981, a significant but not universally influential organization. It represented Jewish communities around the world in diplomatic and political contexts. It had been founded in 1936 in direct response to the rise of Nazism, and its history was one of advocacy for refugees, for restitution, for the recognition of Jewish rights in international forums. Edgar brought to it something it had lacked: aggressive political strategy backed by enormous private wealth. The case that made his reputation internationally was the Kurt Waldheim affair. Waldheim, the former UN Secretary General, was running for president of Austria in 1986 when the World Jewish Congress published research, gathered by its staff and funded in significant part through Bronfman's influence and resources, showing that Waldheim had served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer in Yugoslavia and Greece during periods when mass atrocities against civilians and Jews had been committed. Waldheim had publicly claimed to have spent much of the war convalescing from an injury. The military records told a different story entirely. Edgar Bronfman deployed every lever available to him. He engaged American politicians at the senior level. He pressured the Austrian government through official diplomatic channels. He ensured that the story reached major international media outlets with sustained intensity and documentary support. The campaign did not prevent Waldheim from being elected. He won the Austrian presidency regardless. But it succeeded in having him placed on the American government's watch list of individuals barred from entry to the United States. For a sitting head of state, this was an extraordinary diplomatic humiliation. The campaign demonstrated, to anyone watching carefully, what the Bronfman model of political influence could accomplish. It was not influence over electoral outcomes in the traditional sense. It was the ability to set agendas, to force issues into the public sphere, to apply sustained pressure to governments and institutions through a combination of media management, political relationships, and financial resources that no ordinary advocacy organization could match. Edgar followed this with an even larger operation. Through the 1990s, he led the World Jewish Congress's campaign to recover assets, bank accounts, insurance policies, looted artworks that had been seized from European Jews during the Holocaust and never returned. The Swiss banking system was the primary target. Swiss banks had, since the end of the war, retained billions in dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims and their heirs, while systematically resisting all attempts to identify and restore those assets. The resistance was institutional, sophisticated, and backed by the considerable political influence of Swiss banking interests in international finance. Edgar's campaign was more sophisticated still. It involved legal depositions, coordinated threats of economic boycotts against Swiss financial institutions by American state pension funds, which were large enough customers of Swiss banking services to constitute a genuine financial threat, and direct negotiations at the level of heads of state. Edgar Bronfman sat across the table from the President of Switzerland. He negotiated as an equal, not because the World Jewish Congress was a state, but because he had assembled sufficient political infrastructure that he could credibly deliver consequences that the Swiss banking establishment cared about. The 1998 settlement resulted in Swiss banks paying $1.25 billion to Holocaust survivors and their heirs. It was one of the largest restitution settlements in history, achieved not through legal compulsion, but through precisely the kind of applied political pressure that the Bronfman family had been practicing in less elevated contexts since Sam's first dealings with prairie politicians in the 1920s. The skill was the same. The cause was vastly more morally significant. This is the complexity embedded in the center of the Bronfman political story. The mechanisms of influence, the donation, the relationships, the strategic deployment of wealth to shape outcomes are the same mechanisms whether applied to obtaining a favorable tax ruling for a distillery or recovering stolen assets from Holocaust victims. What changes is the purpose. Edgar Bronfman used the family's inherited tools for causes that were, in many instances, genuinely important and morally serious. But the tools themselves, and the systemic question of whether a private family should have them in the first place, remain unresolved. The American political donation history tells a different part of the story. The Bronfman family's contributions to American politics across the second half of the 20th century were extensive and strategically bipartisan, in the way that very wealthy donors tend to be bipartisan, meaning they gave primarily to Democrats, who controlled more of the regulatory and legislative landscape relevant to their interests, while maintaining sufficient Republican relationships to ensure access regardless of electoral cycles. Edgar's connections to the Democratic Party were deep and documented across decades. He had working relationships with multiple presidents. Bill Clinton knew him well. The family's donation patterns through the 1990s and early 2000s show consistent giving to Democratic candidates at federal and state levels, frequently at maximum levels permitted by campaign finance law. The political access generated was real. Edgar Bronfman Sr. was not a man who left messages with schedulers and waited for callbacks. He was the person the scheduler was told to put through. This access was not exclusively deployed for narrow commercial purposes. The World Jewish Congress work was genuinely civic, but it served commercial functions as well. Seagrams, as a company with significant distribution, tax, and regulatory interests across multiple states and multiple countries, required constant goodwill from government at every level. An industry as heavily regulated as distilled spirits generates need for political access as a routine operational matter. Edgar managed both the civic and the commercial tracks simultaneously, with the clear understanding that the infrastructure for one was also the infrastructure for the other. His brother, Charles Bronfman, pursued a parallel path, remaining more focused on Canadian affairs and Jewish philanthropy. Charles established Birthright Israel, the program that funds free trips to Israel for young Jewish adults from around the world. Since its founding in 1999, the program has sent hundreds of thousands of participants, young people with no previous Israel connection, to experience the country directly. The philanthropic impact on Jewish identity and community cohesion is substantial. The political implications, in terms of diaspora communities' relationship to Israeli policy and American political support for Israel, are more complex and have been debated extensively in both Jewish and broader political circles. The Bronfman family's political influence by the late 1990s spanned continents. In Canada, in the United States, in Israel, and in European diplomatic circles through the World Jewish Congress, the name carried weight. It was invited into rooms. It was consulted before decisions were made. It was, in the transactional language of political economy, a genuine player in multiple theaters simultaneously. Then Edgar Sr. made the decision that would begin the family's long unraveling. He handed Seagrams to his son, Edgar Bronfman Jr., the third generation, born in 1955, had spent much of his adult life pursuing a career in the entertainment industry rather than the family business. He had moved to Los Angeles in his 20s, written film scripts, produced movies with modest success, and inhabited the celebrity-adjacent world of Hollywood that his father's money made accessible. He was charming, well-connected in entertainment circles, and genuinely passionate about the creative industry in a way that his father had never been about whiskey. When Edgar Jr. took operational control of Seagrams in the early 1990s, he made decisions that reflected his personal interests rather than the family's institutional knowledge or the company's core competency. He pushed hard toward entertainment. In 1995, Seagrams purchased MCA Universal from Matsushita for $5.7 billion, one of the largest entertainment industry acquisitions of the decade, funded with capital generated by a Canadian whiskey distillery. The strategy was not entirely irrational. The 1990s was a period when media conglomerates were aggressively assembling content libraries that were, theoretically, going to become extraordinarily valuable as digital distribution emerged. But Edgar Jr.'s execution was uneven, and in 2000 he made the decision that would permanently alter the family's financial position. He sold Seagrams, the entire company, Sam's distillery heritage, the entertainment assets, the brand built from bootleg profits, to Vivendi, a French media conglomerate, for $34 billion in stock. The deal appeared transformative. It was, in cash terms, the largest transaction in Seagram's history. But it was paid in Vivendi stock, and Vivendi was, at that precise moment, one of the most aggressively overextended companies in the world. Within 2 years, Vivendi's stock had collapsed catastrophically. The Bronfman family's $34 billion in shares became worth approximately $3 billion. More than $30 billion in family wealth evaporated in roughly the time it takes a media company to run out of runway. The sale of Seagrams and the subsequent Vivendi collapse represented the largest single destruction of wealth in Bronfman family history. And it happened with a speed that the family's careful, decade-long approach to institution building had never prepared them to absorb. Sam had built slowly, through sustained discipline. Edgar Jr. lost a generational fortune in approximately 24 months. But the Bronfman political infrastructure, the relationships, the access, the reputation assembled over 5 decades of giving and sustained engagement did not immediately reflect the financial loss. Wealth and influence, once established at the Bronfman level, carry significant momentum. Politicians who have received donations and built genuine working relationships do not recalibrate on the basis of quarterly stock performance. Institutions bearing the family name continue operating. The World Jewish Congress did not dissolve because Seagram's was gone. What changed was leverage. Money is the fuel that runs political influence within the system the Bronfmans had operated in for 60 years. Less money meant less fuel. The family retained significant wealth. The Vivendi disaster had not made them poor, merely vastly less rich. But the era of peak Bronfman political dominance was entering its closing phase. Edgar Sr. remained active in the World Jewish Congress. Through the early 2000s, his personal influence in that specific arena still substantial, even as the family's broader political footprint contracted. He continued pursuing the family's traditional focus on Jewish advocacy, on restitution matters, on maintaining the governmental relationships that his decades at the WJC had built. But the next generation was making profoundly different choices, and those choices would ultimately cast a shadow over everything the family had constructed. Edgar Jr., having absorbed the Vivendi loss, pivoted back toward entertainment. He acquired Warner Music Group in 2004 with a private equity consortium and spent the subsequent years attempting to rebuild relevance in a music industry convulsed by digital disruption. It was a business he genuinely understood, and under his leadership, Warner navigated the transition to streaming-era economics with reasonable success. He eventually exited his stake and recovered a meaningful portion of what had been lost in the Vivendi collapse. The political connections from the Seagram's era had not fully dissipated. The Democratic Party fundraising networks that Edgar Sr. had helped construct in the 1990s still recognized the Bronfman name. The family remained active donors, not at Seagram's peak levels, but sufficiently to maintain access to the political relationships that mattered most to their ongoing interests. But it was the daughters of Edgar Jr., Claire and Sarah, his children from his first marriage to Anne Loeb, who would take the Bronfman story into territory that no amount of carefully managed philanthropy could contain. Claire and Sarah Bronfman were heirs to a portion of the Bronfman fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They had grown up in the particular world of inherited wealth, schools, social networks, the assumption that access and comfort were environmental conditions rather than earned outcomes. In the mid-2000s, both became involved with an organization called NXIVM, pronounced Nexium, run by a man named Keith Raniere. NXIVM presented itself as a self-improvement company. It offered executive success programs, personal development courses, intensive workshops built around what it called a rational inquiry approach to human psychology. It had the surface appearance of a sophisticated motivational organization, the kind that proliferated in the corporate development market through the 1990s and 2000s. And it attracted participants from professional and business communities through careful recruitment. Underneath the surface, federal prosecutors would eventually establish. It was something considerably darker. Keith Raniere had founded the organization in the late 1990s after a previous multi-level marketing venture attracted regulatory attention and collapsed under scrutiny. He possessed considerable personal charisma and a documented ability to build intense loyalty in followers. Qualities that prosecutors, survivors, and mental health experts who later testified in his trial characterized as the operational tools of a cult leader. Working at a sophisticated level, Sarah Bronfman encountered NXIVM first, then Claire. Both took the organization's introductory courses. Both moved quickly into the inner circles that NXIVM maintained for its most committed participants. Both became intensely, completely committed to Ranier's philosophy and to the organization's expansion. They also began providing financial support that went far beyond anything resembling normal organizational membership. Over the course of roughly a decade, Claire and Sarah Bronfman transferred an estimated $150 million to NXIVM and to Ranier personally. This money funded the organization's expansion across multiple cities and countries. It funded a legal operation of notable aggression. Teams of lawyers dispatched to pursue former members and journalists who spoke critically about NXIVM's practices with the specific goal of financial exhaustion. It funded Ranier's personal lifestyle in the Albany, New York area, where he lived communally with women who held senior positions within the organization. The legal campaigns against critics deserve particular attention because they reflect something about the Bronfman family's history of using legal resources as instruments of suppression. The Bronfmans had, since Sam's era, maintained expensive legal teams as a standard operational resource. Major wealth requires legal protection, the specific deployment of those resources to silence critics, to pursue journalists and former members through litigation designed less to win than to cost, is a more aggressive application of the same basic principle. Money as a weapon against accountability. Claire Bronfman's financing of NXIVM's legal campaigns provided Ranier with a tool he could not have maintained without her money. Critics who might otherwise have spoken publicly were silenced by the credible threat of ruinous litigation. Journalists who investigated were served with legal demands. Former members who left and attempted to warn others found themselves defendants in civil suits. This is the specific mechanism by which the Bronfman money enabled harm beyond the direct financing of Ranier's lifestyle. It funded the suppression of the accountability that might have ended the organization years earlier. The organization also maintained what it called a women's group, internally designated by the initials DOS, a Latin phrase translating roughly as Lord Master of the Obedient Female Slaves. Within DOS, women were required to provide what the organization called collateral to their direct supervisors, compromising photographs, damaging personal confessions, documents that could be used against them if they attempted to leave. They were also required to recruit additional women into the structure, creating a hierarchical organization in which Ranier occupied the apex position. Federal prosecutors who investigated NXIVM through 2017 and into 2018 characterized it as a criminal organization that used the language and apparatus of self-improvement to recruit, control, and in documented instances physically brand women who were told they were receiving a symbol of personal empowerment. Raniere was arrested in Mexico in March 2018 after fleeing the United States as the investigation closed in. He was extradited and faced charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, and a range of additional federal offenses. Claire Bronfman was arrested in July 2018. The charges against her focused on identity theft and harboring an illegal alien for financial gain. Offenses related to her specific role in NXIVM's operations, including her authorization of the use of members' personal financial information and her facilitation of the housing of individuals whose immigration status was irregular. These were not the most lurid charges in the case. but they were charges supported by documentation that Claire's own legal team could not effectively contest. She pleaded guilty in 2019. The political dimensions of the NXIVM story extended into territory that was deeply uncomfortable for the family's Democratic Party connections, and that discomfort was not incidental. NXIVM had, through the Bronfman sisters' social connections, and through its own deliberate recruitment strategy, made inroads into the political donor class that the Bronfman name made accessible. Raniere and NXIVM officials organized fundraising events that drew political figures. The organization's leadership made donations to political candidates. They cultivated relationships that, in retrospect, represented a systematic strategy of political normalization, the same strategy Sam Bronfman had used in different contexts to convert bootleg money into legitimate standing. Among the campaigns that received NXIVM-connected donations was Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. These donations came from individual NXIVM members rather than from the organization directly, and they were returned when the organization's nature became clearer. But the connection existed in the public record, and it could not be returned along with the checks. The political targeting by NXIVM was not random. The organization was drawn to the same Democratic Party networks that the Bronfman family had cultivated for decades. Claire and Sarah's access to those networks, inherited directly from their grandfather's relationships and their father's maintenance of them, opened doors that Raniere exploited with precision. He was, whatever else he was, perceptive about how social access works and how to leverage it. The distance between Edgar Bronfman Sr. sitting across from the Swiss president to recover stolen Holocaust assets and Claire Bronfman writing checks to suppress the testimony of sex trafficking victims is one of the largest distances traversable within a single family across a single generation. But it was traversed, the same infrastructure, different hands, catastrophic results. The federal prison sentence handed to Claire Bronfman in 2020, 6 years and 9 months, served at a federal facility in California, was the most visible marker of how completely the Bronfman family narrative had reversed in the span of a single generation. Sam Bronfman had wanted, desperately and unsuccessfully, to be recognized by the Canadian establishment as a man of unimpeachable respectability. He had been denied the Senate appointment he coveted. He had been tolerated without being embraced, allowed near the establishment without being absorbed by it. He spent the last years of his life aware that the bootlegging chapter was never quite invisible enough. His granddaughters put a Bronfman in federal prison. The arc of the family's story is one of the most complete illustrations available of what inherited wealth does to accountability. Not destroys it entirely, but stretches it, delays it, complicates it in ways that people without that inheritance do not experience, and that the legal system is not well designed to overcome. Consider the full timeline. Sam Bronfman built a criminal operation that ran for 13 years, generated connections to American organized crime figures, including Meyer Lansky, Arnold Rothstein, and Lucky Luciano, and made him extraordinarily wealthy. He was never charged. He converted the proceeds into a legitimate company. He gave to philanthropies. He built political relationships. He died in 1971, respected within the communities that mattered to him, denied full establishment acceptance, but far beyond prosecution. His son Edgar Sr. deployed the family's accumulated resources for purposes ranging from genuine moral significance, the Swiss banking settlement, the Waldheim campaign, to ordinary self-interested political access of the kind that wealthy donors practice unremarkably across the democratic world. He spent nearly $6 billion of Seagram's capital on an entertainment acquisition, driven by his son's personal interests rather than sound business analysis. He watched that son lose more than $30 billion in a stock transaction that ranks among the most catastrophic individual wealth destruction events in Canadian business history. He died in 2013, mourned in obituaries that emphasized his advocacy work and treated the Vivendi disaster as a footnote. Edgar Jr. destroyed the financial foundation of the family's political influence through decisions that were, in retrospect, transparently reflective of ego over analysis. He rebuilt a portion of the fortune in the music industry. He faced no legal consequences for anything. He remains alive and active in business and philanthropic circles, diminished but not destroyed. Claire Bronfman spent $150 million financing a sex trafficking organization, funded legal campaigns specifically designed to suppress victim testimony, and is serving 6 years and 9 months in federal prison. What changed in the final chapter? The evidence was available and the documentary record was unambiguous. Federal prosecutors had financial transaction documentation, testimony from victims who were willing to testify publicly despite the organization's history of legal intimidation, and a corporate structure, NXIVM, that was considerably simpler to analyze than the interlocking arrangements of a century-old multinational distillery. Claire Bronfman's own financial transfers were traceable. The victims were real and articulate. The charges were specific and supported. This is what accountability looks like when it materializes within the American legal system. It requires not merely wrongdoing. The Bronfman family history contains wrongdoing extending across a century and multiple jurisdictions, but wrongdoing that is sufficiently documented, involving identifiable victims willing to engage the legal process, investigated by prosecutors with adequate resources and genuine institutional will to pursue cases regardless of the defendant's wealth and connections. Those conditions aligned in the NXIVM case in ways they never had before in the family's history. The comparison to the Sackler family is worth dwelling on. Both families built or dramatically expanded fortunes through practices that caused significant, documented harm. Both deployed wealth to build philanthropic and political infrastructure that functioned, for extended periods, as a buffer against accountability. Both eventually faced legal consequences that were real and financially significant, but that fell substantially short of what the scale of harm arguably warranted. The difference that distinguishes the NXIVM outcome from the Purdue Pharma outcome is straightforward. Claire Bronfman went to prison. No Sackler family member faced criminal prosecution of any kind. Prison time is not the only meaningful measure of accountability. Civil settlements can return money to victims. Regulatory sanctions can prevent future harm. Reputational destruction carries its own consequences within certain social worlds. But criminal conviction and incarceration is the most concrete accountability the American legal system produces, and its presence in the Bronfman story marks the case as categorically different from the opioid story in that specific and significant dimension. The NXIVM collapse damaged not only Claire's freedom, but the entire family's constructed public image, and it did so with a brutality that the family's decades of carefully managed philanthropy could not absorb. The juxtaposition was too stark. Birthright Israel, Charles Bronfman's program sending young Jews to connect with their historical homeland, versus NXIVM's branding rituals and federal sex trafficking convictions. Edgar Sr.'s negotiations with Swiss banks on behalf of Holocaust survivors versus his granddaughter's money funding legal campaigns against women who had been enslaved. Sam Bronfman's desperate desire for respectability versus his family's name appearing in federal indictments as the financial engine behind a criminal organization. The media coverage during and after the NXIVM trial reached a global audience, and the Bronfman connection was the mechanism. HBO documentary series, best-selling books, widely listened podcast investigations. All of them used Claire and Sarah's family name as the hook that elevated the story beyond ordinary true crime parameters. A billionaire heiress was central to the story. That made it global. The political fallout followed the pattern that political fallouts from wealthy donor scandals tend to follow in American politics. Initially intense, then managed, then gradually absorbed into institutional memory without structural consequence. Political figures who had received NXIVM-connected donations returned the money and issued carefully worded statements. Those who had attended NXIVM events, and several prominent New York Democrats had attended, unknowingly in some cases and with insufficient scrutiny in others, distanced themselves promptly and completely. The Democratic Party's long relationship with the Bronfman family, a relationship that had produced genuine political access across 5 decades, and that had been maintained through disciplined donation and relationship management across multiple presidential cycles, did not survive the scandal intact. Edgar Jr., who had maintained the family's entertainment industry profile and residual political connections in the years after the Seagram's sale, was substantially diminished by his daughter's involvement. He had not directed their choices. He could not reasonably have been held legally responsible for their decisions. But the family name is not divisible, and the Bronfman name in 2020 carried associations that Edgar Jr.'s lawyers, however skilled, could not reassign. The philanthropic legacy is in a state of active reassessment. The Birthright Israel program, Charles Bronfman's creation, and genuinely his most significant institutional contribution, has been complicated in public perception by its association with a family whose name now carries the NXIVM connection alongside the historical legacy of Jewish advocacy. The program continues operating, and its impact on Jewish identity among young diaspora participants is real and documented. But fundraising conversations that once deployed the Bronfman name as a positive signal now require more careful navigation. Jewish advocacy organizations that maintained Bronfman connections for decades have, in various ways, created distance. The World Jewish Congress work of the Edgar Sr. era is part of the historical record and retains its moral significance independent of subsequent family behavior. But the institutional relationships that Sam and Edgar Sr. built over 5 decades are not being actively maintained at the levels they once were, because the family's capacity to generate political access, which was always the core of what those relationships offered, has contracted significantly. What remains, and what the story of the Bronfman family ultimately illuminates, is the architecture of dynastic political influence in America and Canada. How it is built, how it is maintained, how it decays, and why it resists accountability for as long as it does. Sam built the foundation through a combination of criminal enterprise, commercial genius, and systematic philanthropy. He understood, better than almost any contemporary of his era, that in North American society there is a conversion rate between money and respectability, and that respectability, once achieved, generates political access, and that political access generates commercial advantage, and that commercial advantage generates more money, and that the cycle, once established, becomes largely self-sustaining, Edgar Sr. refined and expanded that foundation using the tools his father had built. He added genuine civic purpose, the Holocaust restitution work, that gave the family's political engagement a moral dimension that Sam's frankly transactional approach had largely lacked. This moral dimension was not merely decorative. It was real and it mattered, but it also served the function of deepening the family's institutional relationships with governments and cultural establishments in ways that made those relationships harder to challenge. Edgar Jr. failed to maintain the commercial foundation and thereby undermined the financial fuel that made the political infrastructure sustainable at scale. His business failures were genuine and consequential, and carried no legal accountability whatsoever, because losing a fortune through bad judgment is not a crime in any jurisdiction the Bronfmans operated in. Claire and Sarah inherited wealth without the institutional discipline that managing a major public company would have imposed. They had freedom, the particular freedom of people with hundreds of millions of dollars and no ongoing business requiring their attention, and they exercised it catastrophically. The absence of the accountability structure that Seagram's operations would have imposed on their public behavior left them without the guardrails that had, however imperfectly, contained the family's more dangerous impulses in earlier generations. This is a pattern that repeats across dynastic wealth. The founder builds through necessity and constraint. The inheritor maintains through discipline. The third generation expands or diversifies. By the fourth, the institutional knowledge has diluted. The original constraints are distant family legend, and the freedom of inherited wealth without purpose becomes its own specific trap. The final accounting for the Bronfman family's century of political influence resists easy moral summary in ways that are themselves revealing. The bootlegging that initiated the fortune was illegal and built on relationships with genuinely dangerous criminal organizations. It was also, in the broader historical context, a response to a policy failure of significant magnitude. Prohibition was repealed because it created more harm than it prevented, and the people who supplied liquor during those years were responding to demand that the law had simply relocated underground. Sam Bronfman was selling whiskey to willing buyers. The criminality is real. The moral weight is more complex than the legal category suggests. The political influence that followed was, for decades, essentially typical of how major North American donors of comparable means operated. Sam and Edgar Sr. did what every wealthy family with similar resources did. They donated to politicians, built relationships, and expected access. They were better at it than most, and they deployed it for purposes that spanned the range from morally serious to nakedly self-interested, but they were operating within a system that actively solicited their participation and rewarded their engagement. The NXIVM chapter is different in kind, not merely in degree. It involved identifiable victims, documented crimes, and the specific use of the family's inherited financial and legal resources to suppress accountability for those crimes. Claire Bronfman went to prison for it. The accountability in that specific and bounded case functioned as the legal system promises it will. What the Bronfman story does not resolve, what no individual family story can resolve, is the deeper structural question of whether the system that enabled Sam's bootleg fortune to become Edgar's political influence, to become Claire's inherited wealth, was, in its essential architecture, a just one. Whether a system in which criminal proceeds can be laundered through philanthropy into political access produces outcomes that serve the societies in which it operates is not a question. The Bronfman family's history answers. It is a question their history poses, with unusual clarity, across an unusually complete arc. Sam died rich and, within the communities that mattered to him, respected. Edgar Sr. died internationally recognized as a significant figure in Jewish advocacy and diplomacy. Edgar Jr. is alive, diminished but financially reconstructed, active in business and occasionally in political circles. Claire Bronfman was released from federal prison in 2023, having served her sentence. The whiskey trucks crossing the Canadian border in 1930 started something. What they started is still running in attenuated form, money that traces back, through layers of legitimization, to bootleg profits still funds institutions and supports relationships. A century of empire assembled from criminal proceeds, refined through philanthropy and systematic political engagement, and eventually partially dismantled by a self-help organization operating out of suburban Albany, New York. The Bronfmans did not buy America's political system. They rented a significant portion of it for a very long time, with very large sums of money. They got what they paid for, and eventually, with different timing and different consequences for different members, they paid for what they got. That is how these stories end, not with clean collapse, but with accounting. Long delayed, always incomplete, and never quite proportionate to the original transaction. The ledger is still open,